So we have been talking a little bit. Actually, we spread it out over several years now. God's our gifts for His glory, and I wanted to touch on some things in this particular lesson that had to do with the idea that sometimes we don't feel very gifted in something. Sometimes we may recognize that that really is not my strong suit. And so when that happens, we can have certain ways of dealing with that, certain ways of thinking about that. And I wanted us to take a look at the book of Nehemiah today and kind of help us look at how we might see our present situation and how we can still be active and how we can still help the church grow. And so this is what we're going to focus on today. And I've decided that we're going to look at Nehemiah and take a look at some of the things that are going on there. And I want us to first set things up in terms of what was going on at the time of Nehemiah. Israel had gone through some difficult times before. They had been enslaved in Egypt for 400 years. God had taken them out of that. When they got into the land of Israel, when they got into the promised land, there were times when they experienced some terrible deprivation in the times of the judges, when they did not have a king. Sometimes things were good, sometimes things were awful. We find that sometimes they were living in caves, sometimes all their crops had been destroyed. We see that. And we see that there was this time, there were these ebbs and flows to how things were in Israel. And a lot of it had to do with, in fact, all of it had to do with how faithful they had been to God or not. When they had been faithful to God, things went well because they were operating under the law that God had given them, and that law works, and God had blessed them. When they were not living the way that God wanted them to do, there were problems. During the kings, there were times when things were good and there were times when things were bad. But eventually, things were so bad in Israel that God said, I can't deal with this anymore. So in 722, the northern kingdoms were exiled to Assyria. And then later on, from 609 to 589, we see a slow and steady but definite decline in Judah as a nation state. And finally, they were completely exiled, and only the very poorest and only those who who did not have very much were left in the land of Judah, while the rest were carried off into captivity in Babylon for 70 years. This is the time that Nehemiah is writing after that. After they are finally able to return to the promised land, after they have finally served their time in exile, after the land of Judah had finally had its 70 Sabbaths, finally they were able to return. Finally they were able to do that. But the fact of the matter is they had not quite recovered. As we take a look at this, they had been allowed to go back. But we find that Nehemiah says that things really haven't worked very well. And so in Nehemiah chapter 1, we see that the words of Nehemiah, son of Hakaliah, in the month of Kislev, in the 20th year, while I was in the citadel of Susa, Hanani, one of my brothers, came from Judah with some other men, and I questioned them about the Jewish remnant that survived the exile and also about Jerusalem. And this is the answer. They said to me, those who survived the exile are back in the provinces, are in great trouble and disgrace. The wall of Jerusalem is broken down and its gates have been burned with fire. And so we see all of this, and we see that there really had not been a recovery of such. Yes, they had been allowed to go back to the land, but it was pretty desperate. Times in Judah were not good. And I can't help but think about this, and we've talked about this even today a little bit, about the troublesome times, and we've talked about how we have gone through some things recently that are troublesome. And we talked about that all last year, and we're still talking a little bit about it because we have not quite recovered either. There are times when churches, there are times when God's people experience difficult times. And then there are times when we suffer along with all the rest of the population as to what is going on in the world, and we can take a look at the COVID-19 pandemic, and we can see all the effects of that, and we can see how that has affected the world. And we know what has happened in this country. And as we are coming out of this, as we are coming out of the pandemic, and we're finally getting some vaccines, and we're finally getting some relief, we see that there are new strains that are coming up that are more virulent and all this, and the vaccines seem to be working against those too. But we're still not quite there as a country. But churches in the United States have suffered too. And for those who are online, we receive messages and information from people who are online who are terribly desirous to be back with the body. We miss each other. We haven't had a full building in over a year. And so we understand too that we also have gone through some troublesome times, and we have not fully recovered. We are looking forward to that full recovery. We are looking forward to that complete rebuilding. And we know that it's coming. We're hopeful. But I want us to take a look at a way forward. I want us to see how Nehemiah dealt with some of this, and what the people dealt with, and how we might be able to apply that today using some unusual gifts and talents. So, a way forward, when we take a look at Nehemiah, we find that Judah needed a Nehemiah, and one of the things that we see about Nehemiah is that he is passionate about his people, he is passionate about his country, he is passionate about his God. And we see this in verses 1 through 4. We see what the people from Jerusalem, Hananiah in particular, says to Nehemiah about the desperate straits that they are in. And Nehemiah responds in this way: "When I heard these things, I sat down and wept. For some days I mourned and fasted and prayed before the God of heaven." And so we see that he has a real passion for what is going on here. He has a real sense of, really, I am in anguish for my people. I feel that. And so I think that one of the things that we see is that passion is important, but we also see that Nehemiah has vision. And we can see this throughout what is going on here. He prays to God, and we can talk about that prayer. It is a beautiful prayer, and he talks about the confession of sins, and he talks about how the people had not done well. They had sinned, and they deserved what they had got. But we see in 1:11 through 2:5 that Nehemiah has a vision. And he says, "O Lord, let your ear be attentive to the prayer of this your servant, and to the prayer of your servants who delight in revering your name. Give your servant success today by granting him favor in the presence of this man." And he is talking about the king himself. "I was the cupbearer to the king." And so it says, "In the month of Nisan, in the 20th year of King Artaxerxes, when wine was brought to him, I took the wine and gave it to the king. I had not been sad in his presence before. So the king asked me, 'Why does your face look so sad when you are not ill? This can be nothing but sadness of the heart.' I was very much afraid, but I said to the king, 'May the king live forever. Why should my face not look sad when the city where my fathers are buried lies in ruins and its gates have been destroyed by fire?' And the king said to me, 'What is it you want?'" And we can see that Nehemiah has been thinking about this. He has been praying about this, and he says, "Then I prayed to the God of heaven, and I answered the king, 'If it pleases the king, and if your servant has found favor in his sight, let him send me to the city in Judah where my fathers are buried, so that I can rebuild it.'" And we see that all of this, what is going on here, is he's got this vision. He knows what he wants to do. And he sees this, but he also understands that there needs to be planning. It's not just enough to be passionate and have a vision, but he sees that we need to have a plan. And so the king, along with the queen sitting beside him, asked him, "How long will your journey take, and when will you get back?" And it pleased the king to send me, so I set a time. And we see in 2:7 and 9 and 11 and 18 that we see that really he does have a plan. He said, "If it pleases the king, may I have letters to the governors of the Trans-Euphrates so that they will provide me safe conduct until I arrive in Judah? And may I have a letter to Asaph, keeper of the king's forest, so he will give me timber to make beams for the gates of the citadel by the temple, and for the city wall, and for the residence I will occupy." And because the gracious hand of God was upon me, the king granted my request. And so we see all of this going on. In 11 and 18, we see that Nehemiah makes his way to Jerusalem. And what does he do there? And we're not going to read all those verses, but we see that what he does is he goes to Jerusalem. He has not seen it himself. He has only heard first-hand accounts, and so he's got it second-hand. And so he goes and he scopes out the city. He doesn't tell people what he's doing. He's looking. What do we need here? What needs to be done? How can we go about doing it? And so he comes up with this plan, and he makes this plan. And he tells the people, you see the trouble we are in. This is in verse 17. Jerusalem lies in ruins, and its gates have been burned with fire. Come, let us rebuild the wall of Jerusalem, and we will no longer be in disgrace. He plans. And then the final thing is he's got endurance, because not everything goes smoothly. There are some rascals who are interested in making sure that Jerusalem is not rebuilt. And we find that they turn up again and again in the book of Nehemiah. And we can see this in 3:19. I have the wrong verse here. I do apologize. We have Sanballat, and we have some other ones. Let's go to 4:1, because that one is there, but we see that it's even before that. When Sanballat heard that we were rebuilding the wall, he became angry and was greatly incensed. He ridiculed the Jews, and in the presence of his associates and of the army of Samaria, he said, "What are these feeble Jews doing? Will they restore their wall? Will they offer sacrifices? Will they finish in a day? Can they bring the stones back to life from those heaps of rubble, burned as they are?" Tobiah the Ammonite, who was at his side, said, "What are they building? If even a fox climbed up on it, he would break down their wall of stones." We see it also in 6:1-9. In all of this, we have Sanballat, and we have Tobiah, and we have Geshem the Arab, and the rest of the enemies. That they heard that they had rebuilt the wall, and not a gap was left in it. And we find that all this is going on. And Sanballat and Geshem sent me this message: "Come, let us meet together in one of the villages on the plain of Ono." Why in the world Nehemiah would ever want to do that is beyond me. And he doesn't. And he said, "I knew that they were scheming to harm me." And we find out all of that. And then they pull an ace out of their sleeve, and they said, "We want you to know something. It is reported among the nations," and Geshem says, "It is true that you and the Jews are plotting to revolt, and therefore you are building the wall. Moreover, according to these reports, you are about to become their king, and have even appointed prophets to make this proclamation about you in Jerusalem. There is a king in Judah. Now this report will get back to the king, so come, let us confer together." And Nehemiah says, "You're just making this up out of your heads." But let's not forget, the city of Jerusalem was in dire straits. Things were exceptionally bad. And Nehemiah was dealing with these problems throughout his entire time that he is trying to get that city wall rebuilt. Sometimes we need Nehemiah. In fact, I would venture to say that we need Nehemiahs. We need people who can say, look, for our church to grow, for our church to go forward, we need to have passion, and we need to have vision, and we need to have a plan, and we need to make sure that we have endurance, because it can't be done in a day. Some point, this pandemic and all the effects of the pandemic are going to be away. They're going to go. We're going to need to strengthen our brothers and sisters who are not attending in any way, who used to be. We're going to need to make sure that we have things in place to make people feel welcome again. We need to make sure that we are doing everything that we can in order to instill within one another the passion that the church needs. We need Nehemiahs. But the other thing that we see is that the people did what needed to be done. Well, not everyone. What we find are some very interesting passages about what exactly was getting done and how it was getting done. And what we find is that there were some people who just weren't all that wild about doing it. And we see that there is a section of the wall repaired by the men of Tekoa. And it says, "But their nobles would not put their shoulders to the work under their supervisors." They just wouldn't do it. What was that? We're too good for this, maybe. Or however in the world they were thinking, they would not do what needed to be done. We also see this in 5:3 through 12. What is happening is people are putting an awful lot of effort into rebuilding this wall, but there are situations in which it's not just a matter of building the wall, it's also a matter of how do you feed yourselves? How do you make sure that your family's taken care of? How do you make sure that all that is taken care of when we're busy building a wall? What do we do in terms of our fields? What do we do in terms of our vineyards? What do we do in all of this? And what we find is that some people were not supporting the work at all. In fact, they were taking advantage of the progress that was being made on the wall for their own benefit. And so we see that people were mortgaging their fields and their vineyards and their homes to get grain during a famine. And still others were saying, we've had to borrow money to pay the king's tax on our fields and vineyards, although we are of the same flesh and blood as our countrymen, and though our sons are as good as theirs, yet we have had to subject our sons and daughters to slavery. Some of our daughters have already been enslaved, but we are powerless because our fields and our vineyards belong to others. They were mortgaging their fields so that they could go ahead and get this wall built. When I heard their outcry and these charges, I was very angry, and I pondered them in my mind, and then accused the nobles and officials. I told them, you are exacting usury from your own countrymen. He says, don't do it. To their credit, they said, we're not doing that anymore. They came around and did what was needed to do. But we find that there were people who actually did do what needed to be done. We'll contrast this with some of the things that we see in 3:1. Eliashib, the high priest, and his fellow priests. These are people that had a gift. They had a function. They had a position. They were the high priest and their fellow priests. They were the ones who were responsible for making sacrifices. They were making sure that the sins of the people were expiated. They made sure of all of that. And yet, what did they do? They rebuilt the sheep gate. They dedicated it and set its doors in place, building as far as the Tower of the 100, which they dedicated as far as the Tower of Hananel. And so we see that they were doing this. We see this in verse 12. Shallum, son of Halohesh, ruler of the half-district of Jerusalem, repaired the next section with the help of his daughters. And so we see that this ruler, he's there and he's saying, hey, daughters, let's come. Let's go ahead and let's get this taken care of. And so they're putting their hands to the work. They're putting their hands to taking these burned bricks, these burned stones, and laying them on one another and rebuilding a wall. Is that what he was used to doing? No, he is the ruler of the half-district of Jerusalem, and yet that is what he is doing. In 15 and 16, we see that the fountain gate was repaired by Shallum, son of Kol-Hezah, ruler of the district of Mizpah. He rebuilt it, roofing it over, and putting its doors and bolts and bars in place. He also repaired the wall of the pool of Siloam by the king's garden as far as the steps going down to the city of David. And beyond him, Nehemiah, son of Azbuk, ruler of a half-district of Beth-zur, made repairs up to the point opposite the tombs of David. We see this, etc., etc., etc. We see these people. Yes, they have a vision. They have something that they are doing, that they are making sure that they are getting done. It's not necessarily their gift. It's not necessarily their talent. It's not necessarily their vocation. But they're taking care of business and getting done what needs to get done. And what I want us to see also, if we take a look at chapter 3, and I think that it is interesting because we see entire towns, we see the men of entire villages coming out to help in this process. We don't know what their professions were. We don't know what they did for a living. We don't know how they took care of their families. We don't know that. But we do know that entire villages came and they dedicated themselves to doing this. So we can contrast that with the nobles of Tekoa. And we can say that these people didn't look at it as being beneath them at all to do something that they are not normally doing. We see in 4:6, so we rebuilt the wall till all of it reached half its height, for the people worked with all their heart. We see this. We see that all of the people are working. And we see that even as they go through all sorts of difficulty, we see Sanballat, Tobiah, the Arabs, and the Amorites, and Ammonites, and the men of Ashdod. We see all of this, and they're still working. And they go for it, and they do what needs to be done. I think that one of the lessons that we need to take from this is that sometimes it's not a matter of what our gifts are. It's a matter of what needs to be done. And so it may not be something that we're used to doing. Maybe we can take a look at something and say, well, maybe I'm not really all that good at encouraging, but guess what? Maybe encouraging needs to happen. Maybe AV wasn't your thing, but we've got people working on AV. Maybe all this electronic stuff is not your thing, but we have people working on that. Maybe making sure that all the communion is taken care of in bags and making sure that that is ordered, making sure that all that, maybe administration is not necessarily your gift, but maybe that's something that you've been doing. Doing what needs to get done when it needs to get done. It's part of it. I am reminded of Paul, what he says in 2 Corinthians 12, 9 and 10. He is talking about the thorn that is in his flesh. He's talking about his weakness. And he's talking about how many times he has prayed to God, please take this weakness away from me. We don't know what that thorn in his flesh was. He doesn't talk about that. The people in Corinth probably had some kind of idea, although we don't even know that. There have been all sorts of speculations as to what that weakness was and what that was. We just don't know. But we do know this, that he prays to God, and God says, my grace is made perfect in weakness. My strength is enough for your weakness. And so Paul says, I will glorify in my weakness, because in this, God is glorified. And so we have Paul, who is not necessarily looking at this particular thing as anything that he wants to use or anything that he's wanting to be a part of, but God is making something beautiful out of it. And so as we reach out in ways that we may never have reached out before, because it needs to get done, God is glorified. And so the question is, what needs doing now? And can we commit to doing it? I see for this congregation a bright future in which, once again, we will all be together, those who are online and those who are here every week, and we can finally engage in the kind of fellowship that we were used to before all of this happened. I see a time of encouragement. I see a time of refreshing. I see a time of renewal. I also see that we will need to be very flexible in how we define our gifts so that we can make all that happen. If you're not a Christian, we offer the opportunity. We offer the invitation to do that, to become a Christian. And really the invitation is open all the time. It's not just a matter of us making this offer once a week. It's open all the time. And so for those of you who are online, and for those of you who are here, if you've decided that this is the day that you want to put on your Lord and Savior Jesus Christ in the waters of baptism, we can make that happen. Please contact us in whatever way we can. We will help. We will use our gifts to help you. Please come.